Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Peterson. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Fountain. We are a high volume hiring platform. And today I am here to talk about workplace stress as the next pandemic, and specifically how to build resilient and thriving teams. And I think the word resilience is probably familiar to all of us at this point. It's something that we've all had to talk a lot about over the past few years. Global circumstances have necessitated resilience from all of us to varying degrees. And the pressure of today's workplace is far greater than it may have been even just a few short years ago. So, we're also combating the results of over a decade of glorified hustle culture in combination with the wild circumstances of the past few years. And there are certain myths about success that have become ingrained in our workforce, especially for those who may have come out of school over the course of the last recession. And to understand how to build resilient and thriving teams today, we actually need to take a look back at the myths that are left over from that hustle culture of the early and mid 2010s, the recent tech booms that got us to where we are right now. And we have to talk about what our responsibility is as leaders to debunk those myths for our teams. So, as I like to say here, thriving teams begin with myth busting managers. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about three of those myths that I think are most pervasive and those that are causing the epidemic of stress that we're seeing in the workplace today. Myth number one, bring your whole self to work. And like so many pieces of good advice, this one, if taken too far, does backfire. There is too much of a good thing here. In this sense, on the positive side of this myth, everyone on your team at every organization should feel as if they can bring their authentic self to work. They should not have to hide who they are, how they prefer to speak or be addressed. All of that is critical to a thriving team because folks not being able to bring their authentic selves to work, that will end up using up a lot of their energy on trying to present a version of themselves that is different to who they really are. And that's not a recipe for success. But the flip side is where stress comes into play. So bringing our whole selves to work, which first of all, if we look at the past few years, we have all been called upon to bring our whole selves to work in ways that are completely outside of what we would have ever imagined in 2019. Remote work, the results of the pandemic meant that we were working amid kids, pets, family obligations, the doorbell ringing with our latest delivery. And so the barriers between home and work life really have been broken down. But when we think about what it means to bring your whole self to work in sort of a negative context, look at the areas of your life where you're expected to bring your whole self, and usually that comes down to family relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, our relationships within our community. Those are all areas where you are expected to bring your whole self. And that leads to a reciprocal action because that is a human to human interaction. But if we bring our whole selves in that way to work, we don't get that reciprocal action because our companies, despite what we may like to believe, are not people. They can't reciprocate when we are pouring all of that emotion, all of that passion, all of that energy into work in the same way that you would get reciprocation in another one-to-one human relationship. And so that leads to what can be a one-sided and all-encompassing focus on work. And it makes things personal that really shouldn't be personal. And I think this is something that is particularly rampant in the United States. We tend to be very focused on our value of self in relation to our job, to our career. And that means that suddenly, if you make a mistake at work, or if someone on your team makes a mistake, or you receive a criticism, and you're too entrenched in that whole self mantra, that criticism, that mistake becomes about you as a person, not you in the role of doing your job. And your career very easily begins to define you in a way that isn't healthy. And I have plenty of examples of this in my own life, as I'm sure many of us do. But one that comes to mind for me, a few years back, I was working for a young, hungry startup, the type of place that had expletive-filled mugs in the kitchen cabinets encouraging us to get stuff done and work harder, work faster. And after a couple of months, that job did not pan out for me. And I found myself unemployed for really the first time in over a decade since I had been out of college. And my husband said, "Oh, well, this is great for you. Maybe this is the opportunity to kind of dig in and pay more attention to your hobbies and your interests." And it took me about 2 days to realize that I didn't have any hobbies and I didn't know what my interests were because for so long, I had been purely connected to my sense of self and value of self as a marketing leader for startup X, startup Y. And so it wasn't until that was taken away from me that I realized I did have a lot of work to do to figure out who I was, what I valued, what I was interested in outside of my working self. And that was really a wake up call to me, especially in the way that I manage teams now, to ensure that we are allowing the time for our teams to gain their value outside of work. And so rather than bringing your whole self to work, we should be encouraging our teams to bring yourself to work, but don't lose yourself. So the things that make the members of your team unique, their passions and interests and who they are, all of those things are critical to building a thriving team. We need to build those interpersonal relationships. But it is also our responsibility to encourage our teams not to lose themselves in the work. And that's something that can be particularly challenging for folks who might be earlier in their careers because they're very hungry, they want to succeed. And it's something that we as managers have to pay very close attention to and make sure that we are monitoring our teams, how they're doing, how their energy levels are, and ensure that we're setting an example in the way we show up to guide our teams in the way that they can show up. Myth number 2, empathy and productivity are opposing behaviors. So this goes back to an idea that you can't be quote unquote too soft on your teams because they'll take advantage of it. And sure, there are always some bad apples who might, but by and large, empathy begets productivity. And the reason for that is because displaying empathy builds trust, and trust is the bedrock of a productive, thriving team. So when members of your team feel as though they're being seen as people, they're more motivated to deliver their best work. And they trust you as a leader to come to you if they're facing an obstacle, and they know that you will help them work through that with informational empathy. And this is especially in critical consideration of, again, what we've gone through in the past few years. Emotional intelligence in leadership cannot be overstated. And one of the things that we've seen as a trend certainly is a greater focus of leadership on what used to be considered soft skills, but really, as we've now found, especially in the past few years, are the critical skills to leading thriving teams in such a volatile time. And so in short, empathy and productivity are not opposing. They are, in fact, two sides of the same coin. And I would argue that it is impossible to build a resilient team if you don't leave any room to understand humanity and to encourage your teams to empathize with one another. And myth number 3, hours of work equals quality of work. So this is a myth that has plagued the working world, probably since the Industrial Revolution. The idea that the more you work, the higher quality your work. And one of the side effects of an increasingly remote working world is a lack of visibility for employers into when and how exactly their teams are working. And this has led us to 2 different types of organizations. One, there are organizations that have dedicated extensive time and resources into monitoring every aspect of their remote employees' working days. And then on the flip side, there are employers who have embraced a flexible, trust-based working style. And I think we get one guess as to which one of these tends to breed a higher quality of work. And as with all things, there is a balance here. But from a leadership perspective, it's important to stress to your teams that they should be able to communicate with you, and this goes back to the empathy piece, about where, when, how they work best. Because having transparency into their working styles as a leader will allow you to understand when they're going to be the most productive without locking them into that virtual version of, butts in seats from 9 to 6, no matter what. Because that line of thinking, and from a managerial standpoint, the push to say you have to work in this specific way at this specific time point, that tends to breed a mindset on teams of the more hours I work, the better I am as an employee. And the more hours I work can often actually translate into the more hours my Slack bubble is green or my Microsoft Teams bubble is green, the more quickly I'm answering emails. And that can lead to burnout, and that is a recipe for stress induction for your teams. So we also know and have to bear in mind that folks are working more frequently and more hours in remote environments. We've seen a lot of studies pointing to folks no longer commuting 2 hours a day, for example, but they're using those 2 hours sitting at their desk getting work done, which, again, in small doses can be incredibly valuable for an organization and for that team member, but as part of a broader trend that can be damaging and lead to burnout. And I think it's important for us as managers not to fall into the trap that, you know, the person who's answering emails the fastest or the person whose Slack bubble is green for the greatest number of hours in the day is the most productive team member. I think looking at those sort of false KPIs can lead us to misunderstanding and misrepresenting the work that our teams are doing. Because ultimately, quality counts, but downtime helps produce it. And I'll admit, this is something that can be very challenging for leaders as well. I know I've certainly struggled with it because it's tempting when you're managing a group of people to be always on for them, always available for them. But 24/7 availability is not sustainable. And we have to be very thoughtful about the example that we set for our teams. So if you're answering and sending emails at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night, but you don't want your team modeling that kind of behavior, then it's probably time that you reassess why you're doing that and ask yourself, if this isn't the example that I want my team to follow, why am I getting caught up in this habit? And as managers and leaders, we need to be honest with ourselves and ask the question, how might my actions be perpetuating an environment that I say I do not want for my team? And that level of honesty is incredibly important as a manager. And it's also very valuable to have a level of transparency with your team where you can say, if you've been exhibiting behaviors that you don't want them to match, hey, I've noticed that this is a behavior that I'm guilty of. It's not one that I want to perpetuate. And it's not one that I expect this team to model. And I'm going to work on that. So finally, if there are three things to take away in consideration of what builds a thriving team, especially in the midst of our current environment, a thriving team operates with sustainability, resilience, and boundaries. And those are really the threads that weave all of the myth busting together that I just talked about. And I do believe that of all of those, that sustainability piece is so critical because we've all been through crazy stretches of work and projects that push our limits. But that cannot become the norm. Because if it is, then our teams aren't working in a way that's sustainable and they'll experience prolonged periods of stress that can risk leading to burnout. And then when you work with sustainability in mind, it is easier to be resilient and bounce back from challenges. And finally, you're better able to set boundaries and encourage your team to do the same. And that's something that goes a long way because setting clear expectations and boundaries and encouraging that from your team will lead them to perform at a higher level and be better equipped to manage stress. Thank you all so much for joining me today for this conversation. And if you have any questions or you'd like to continue the conversation, my email is included here, and I'd look forward to hearing from you.